Hello and welcome to another episode of our Talking Development series, in which Concord examines a few important development cooperation issues, particularly related to the EU and its policy and practice. CONCORD is the European Confederation of NGOs working on relief and development, and I'm Tanya Cox, the director. Today I'm joined by Professor Tim Jackson, who has agreed to stop by Concord to answer a few questions. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tanya. Good to be here.
Tim, you are now very well known on talking about the subject of prosperity without growth.
That's because there's not too many people talking about it, so it's kind of easy to be well known in the subject.
But you also did do a very good book.
Well, thank you.
That helps a lot.
Yeah.
And you have been very kind to stop by us today to answer a few questions and to discuss the ideas around inequalities and prosperity without growth with us.
Yeah.
Concord has been taking for a number of years an increasingly systemic approach to its work. And we have been now focusing for, I would say, 5 to 7 years on the impact of our current economic model, based as it is on growth in gross domestic product, and the impact that has on both the environment, but also on the inequalities that we're seeing growing quite considerably, particularly between people in any one country, but also between countries. And so I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you is, if we know that the neoliberal model, as it is, based on economic growth, privatisation, free markets, a small role for the state, this kind of thing, if we know that's not working, what would actually be the key ingredients for an economic model that would work in the favour of people and planet, putting well-being of people and planet first and foremost?
Yeah, a difficult question, and to just summarise a very simplistic answer, in some sense it is about putting those principles up front. So when I first published Prosperity Without Growth, which you were kind enough to mention, it was a government report, and as a government report I had to simplify it for a policy audience and make sure that message was clear to politicians who wanted to know what to do on Monday. And I provided for them a very, very simplistic picture, which was basically 3 things. Establish the limits, because we live on a finite planet, and if you don't know where those limits are, you can't really organise your economy in relation to them. Fix the economics, because at that point, which was 10 years ago, everybody could see they were broken. The financial system itself wasn't working. There wasn't a sufficient prudential regulation of the financial system to have it functional even in its own terms, let alone to invest in saving the planet or increasing prosperity for people, and change the social logic. So those things: establish the limits, fix the economics, change the social logic. And they're each of them, of course, incredibly hard, difficult things to do in their way. But the whole point about policy really is to invest in that kind of change, to say, if we know the principles of the economy that we want, let's now devise the policies that will get us towards that goal. And for something as basic as the planet, if you're not counting the difficulties that the planet is itself encountering because of human society, then you're not even at the starting point. So companies must know how much carbon they're emitting. They must know what's in their supply chains. They must know their impacts on biodiversity, and governments as well. And unless you've established those limits and integrated them into your economy, it's never going to work for the planet. Similarly with the social logic, if you're continually making workers suffer the pain of the policies that you're putting in place to try and squeeze growth out of the system by protecting the interests of the owners of capital, then you're going to have a very, very dysfunctional, unequal economy. And putting that right means first identifying what those levers are, second prioritising the place you want to be, putting justice right at the heart of the economy, and third, implementing policies to achieve that.
And maybe I could just follow up on that to ask you, if you were to give some indications of those key policies, what are they, the exact policy, what would you prioritise in order to really bring down the inequalities that we're seeing?
The inequality thing is really interesting. I think the starting point for understanding how to tackle inequality is to see where it's coming from in the system. And it's really interesting to look at the reduction in inequality that happened over the first 50 years or so, 50 to 60 years of the 20th century. And actually that was a point where we were doing the right things in the right way to give ordinary people the benefits of the prosperity that we delivered through the economy. And the poorest part of the population profited most from that prosperity, and the richest profited least, as it should have been, because that makes society more equal. And then that was turned around almost entirely in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and inequalities increased since that point. And you have to ask yourself, why did it increase? And I think it increased for a couple of reasons. One was that the economy itself was slowing down. So we were moving towards an economy without so much growth. And you can come back at me later and say, well, how does that fit with your hypothesis of prosperity without growth? And I'll try and answer it. And as the economy slows down and labour productivity slows down in particular, that means that the margins for producers, for industry and enterprise is squeezed. So you end up trying to pay your workers less wages, and you invest less in your economy, and sometimes you distribute less to your shareholders as well. But we had a set of policies put in place which said, actually, we're going to protect the interests of shareholders. We're going to protect the interests of the owners of our productive capacity, because that's what's going to give us growth back. And it failed completely. All it led to was an over-indebted system, wages that were too low for workers, and a financial crisis in the beginning of this century from which we're still recovering. So if you take those lessons on board, you think to yourself, well, inequality is increasing, perhaps we should tax the rich more. And you look at an increased tax on the rich, and you find, yeah, it just about marginally makes a difference, but it doesn't stop that escalation in inequality as an economy slows down. So let's say, well, we'll tax capital instead. We'll put a tax on capital. If you can swing that in political terms, that would be great. And that was Piketty's suggestion, actually, when he was looking at inequality in the 20th century and capitalism in the 21st century. He said we need to tax capital. Put that in place. It's a little bit better sometimes than an income tax, a differentiated income tax. It doesn't really stop runaway inequality. You ask the question of a basic income. Can we put a basic income there? Because if people haven't got money because they haven't got jobs, then you give them a basic income to give the basic decent necessities of life. And again, what's interesting about that is it's even less effective than some of the other mechanisms. And that's not an argument against a basic income. What it's telling us is that all three of those kinds of conventional mechanisms don't stop runaway inequality. There's only one thing that stops runaway inequality, and it's taking back that privileging of the interests of the owners of capital and giving some interest to workers, saying there is a basic right to work, there's a minimum wage for work, there's a decent conditions of work in the workplace. And what all of those things do actually is they protect the wage rate in a decent society and ensure that workers are able to earn a livelihood. And that, to me, there's a fancy word for it, which you may or may not want to know, but it's called the elasticity of substitution between labour and capital. And if you slow that substitution between labour and capital down and protect the rights of people to work, then you have the beginnings of a framework in which you can make society much more equal. It's not just about taxation and redistribution. It's actually about the structure of the economy that we live in.
So are we talking about government policy really here? Are we saying that actually we shouldn't be leaving this to companies just to do the right thing, but in actual fact it should be governments who are coming in?
Yeah, I don't think you can leave it to companies, because the normal setup of a profit-driven company in the interests of shareholders is a part of the problem. So you will get good companies who do much better, who implement a living wage, for example, across their supply chains, who engage their stakeholders beyond shareholders in setting the distribution of profits and the investment of their revenues in future production. So you get good companies, and corporate social responsibility has been with us quite a long long time. We've seen quite a lot of that stuff come and go. But there are a couple of reasons why that's never going to entirely do it. And the first, of course, is that companies are essentially self-interested entities that are in the pursuit of profit. And so actually what you're asking them to do is to return to society some of the gains that they have from being able to make a profit. And in order to do that, you need a structure, you need regulation, you need a framework within which people can do the right thing as a company without being disadvantaged from their competitors, and ensure that their workers, their shareholders, their stakeholders are actually all being rewarded in the way in which they should be rewarded. So the government role in setting the frameworks and the regulatory structures under which companies operate is absolutely vital.
Given that we are in a situation today where we've got to see a huge accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few, and that they have really very considerable influence, perhaps I would say even unhealthy influence, over policy making and decision making, what do you think is actually a realistic and the best way forward to break down this concentration of power?
I mean, I think to some extent, you know, the role of the state, and Adam Smith, to go right back into economic history, pointed this out very, very clearly, that the market stops working at the point at which monopoly power begins to build up. And the only thing that can break that is the power of government. The bigger the corporations that you have, the bigger the government that you need to regulate it. So you cannot do without government. And working with policymakers, working in particular around the issue of social justice, which is now a very live debate in society, is a place where we can begin to build the power of government up again in order to provide the frameworks that will give us back social justice, because I think we should be under no illusions that it's kind of been taken away, and it's been taken away exactly by those forces, those very, very powerful forces that have begun not only to manipulate the market, but even to draw government in ways that make it easier for them to manipulate the market. And short of that process working, so short of participative democracy, where we lobby with and engage with government over specific policies that will give us back social justice, it seems to me that the appropriate response, if that stops working, actually is activism. It is actually putting those ideas onto the streets in the hands of people, and those people are what give government legitimacy. And when they withdraw their support for that participative democracy and get themselves out on the streets, as we have seen since the financial crisis, actually, the Occupy movement, Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes, all of that social energy has to be pushing at government to say, your room for manoeuvre, your legitimacy as government ends at the point at which you stop providing a social contract that protects justice for ordinary people.
I couldn't agree more with you on that. I think what we've seen is that a lot of the social activism, if you like, and the people coming out on the streets, however, has been largely around the climate. And there are clear and obvious links between the economy and the climate, but it doesn't necessarily mean we'll have a reorientation of economic policy towards social justice. At least that's what I'm a little bit concerned about.
That's true. In itself, it doesn't. From Extinction Rebellion, I mean, I think the one exception, which is also on the streets, is the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and that is very specifically around social justice. And the Occupy movement, to be honest, was also about social justice. It was not specifically at that point about the climate at all. So, and we think of ourselves as living in a kind of populist age, where what we mean by populism is right-wing populism that's verging on nationalism and beginning to destabilize democracy in the ways that we have experienced it. But actually there is also a populism, and it was born out of, to some extent, born out of protest at the financial crisis, and it's pursued those two themes, I think, of people and planet through that time. And if you look at what Extinction Rebellion, for example, is talking about, they're not just talking about planet. They're talking about system change, not climate change.
If we try to go forward and we say, okay, we want to work more on social justice, we see that policymakers are interested in social justice, they're increasingly aware that inequalities are growing and that they are a problem. Unfortunately, it's often framed as they're a problem for economic growth. Yeah. And we very soon come back to the growth terminology. And given that policymakers have been wedded to creating economic growth for 50 years now, they sort of stake their political careers practically on it. How do you think we as CONCORD, but anybody joining forces together, could best persuade policymakers that we really need to move away from this now if we want to get social justice?
Yeah. The critiques of economic growth have been around a long time. So Robert Kennedy, 51 years ago this year, made the point that the GDP is just a very, very poor measure of progress. 2009, we had the Sarkozy Commission, which basically agreed with that point, that the GDP is not a very good measure of progress. We had a lot of emphasis at that time around looking for measures and indicators beyond GDP. So that's a really interesting development of that particular conversation around growth. And my experience of it is actually sitting from 10 years ago, when even asking the question was really not allowed, not in polite company, to ask whether you could think about an economy without growth. In the 10 years since that point in time, things have shifted, and I think they've shifted quite dramatically. And just a couple of sort of reasons why this is a good time to raise that challenge of the GDP again, and it being a poor indicator. And one of them is the understanding that the economy, even in its own terms, is not looking like it's going to be able to deliver the kind of growth that we've been expecting over the last 2 or 3 decades. The growth rate is slowing down. Even mainstream economists are beginning to understand that and recognize that. And it's beginning to sharpen the minds of politicians and even of mainstream economists. If we are in a growth-based society that's pushing at growth the whole time, and we've been so spectacularly unsuccessful in maintaining that growth rate, then where do we go from there? And the two possibilities, it seems to me, one is that the mainstream says, well, you should push harder. It's obvious. You haven't pushed hard enough. Let's push harder. Let's have more debt. Let's try and protect the interests of capital even more. Let's force growth out of the system somehow. Let's, forget planet altogether and just push for economic growth. So no, well, exactly. But you might expect that reaction, because the mainstream establishment, the mainstream ideology, does not know where to go in a system which has always been predicated on growth, and in which growth is slowing down, disappearing, in fact, in some places. And so at that point in time, you have to be able to address the idea of a post-growth economy. Not necessarily that you're turning a dial down somewhere that says, no, we don't want growth, we want degrowth, but rather that you're saying growth is not the be-all and end-all of anything. Robert Kennedy pointed it out 50 years ago. Sarkozy pointed it out 10 years ago. What we know is that this growth-based system has trashed the planet, undermined social security, created financial instability, created huge social injustice. Now is the time to think about a different way of organising the economy. Just forget or sideline, or just put on the back burner the whole question of the GDP and growth, and concentrate on the things that you matter. You want livelihoods for people, you want social justice between communities, you want to stay within the limits of the planet, you want people to be able to participate in society, you want to be able to thrive and flourish as human beings. And what to me is the most interesting thing of all, I suppose, about the debate is now that I will sometimes have panel sessions with really quite conventional economists, and they'll say to me things like, actually, we don't really think that GDP is a very good indicator. We don't really think that we even pursue GDP that much. And it's almost as though, in the face of these realities, you and I, as campaigners, may not need to do that much at all, because the allegiance to that goal is being undermined by the system itself. And what we have to do is be ready to stand in that place, in that space, and say, these are the solutions: establish the limits, fix the economics, change the social logic.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Tim. We will carry on with our work then on trying to redefine what progress is all about. And
Very good.
hope that we can work together to do that.
Thanks,
Thank you
Tanya.
very much. Thank you.